See, it's 2 o'clock Eastern. Here, Laura.
So it is time to begin. So I want to start off by welcoming everyone to episode 6 of Teaching Unpacked. I think 6. I'm doing a terrible job of keeping track of these numbers. Before we begin, I want to just take a minute to do a couple of thank yous. First off, I'd like to thank Peter and Molly Eppig. Their generous support of this project is what enables us to do it every 2 weeks. And of course, Peter, as the architect of the model, none of us would be doing this wonderful work without his wonderful work in putting together the critical skills classroom. I'd also like to thank Harold Hale, who is working behind the scenes to answer any questions that people have about technical problems. You can drop those in the chat and Harold will help you. And I want to thank Peg Smeltz and Shelley Viles. They've been the people who've helped us get the word out and who have taken care of registration questions and who will answer any questions that you have after the fact about things like certificates. I think we want to introduce ourselves first, Tom. So do you want to go ahead and go first?
Hello, everyone. It's Tom Julius here, a faculty member at Antioch University, New England in the Education Department and the director of the Integrated Learning Program and former early elementary teacher. I started out teaching kindergarten, taught 2nd grade and 3rd grade, and at one point taught a summer rocket camp. We'll have to have a session on that another time, Laura.
Yeah. And actually, when you say you taught a summer rocket camp, I think my son actually went to your summer rocket camp today. Yeah. And I'm Laura Thomas. I'm the director of the Experienced Educators program at Antioch, and was a high school speech theater and English teacher, and now am a 1-day-a-week librarian in a K-6 school, as well as being full-time faculty at Antioch. So a couple of housekeeping things really quickly. As I mentioned before, if you have questions about technical stuff, drop that in the chat. If you have content questions, please use the Q&A feature so that we can track those. Everything is being recorded today, and the video will be available on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/criticalskills1. I'll drop a link in the chat at the end of our time today that will take you to a resources page that will have a link on it for the evaluation and also where you can get a certificate. And finally, just, this webcast is the intellectual property of Antioch University. We'd love to have you share any of this information, but please cite or credit Antioch or Allison Robinson, who is our featured speaker today. So Tom, do you want to introduce Allison and get us going?
Allison, it is so good to have you here on Teaching Unpacked. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Allison is, as you can see on this slide, currently teaches 7th and 8th grade at the Monadnock Regional Middle High School in Swansea, New Hampshire. And Allison is going to talk to us today about teacher as coach and facilitator. It's really, I was thinking as we were preparing for this webcast, how we hear constantly how for a modern 21st, to teach modern 21st century skills, that teachers need to be the sage, stop being the sage on the stage and be the guide on the side. We get told that frequently, but it's not very often that we really hear about, okay, how do we do that? What is it that, what does that mean to be the guide on the side? And how do you become a coach as opposed to the kind of teacher that a lot of us, when we were in school, and those of us who became teachers who were good at school, end up emulating the teacher who tended to be that sage on the stage type. So going from that to being the coach of our students who are gaining those 21st century skills is, I'm really looking forward, Allison, to hearing your take on that. Allison, in addition, Allison's, to her credit, in addition to being a teacher, has been a coach in other ways, including track and field coach and destination imagination coach, which is a national problem-solving competition for, is it like elementary through college age, Allison?
Yeah. Yep, and it's international. There's, in fact, they just closed global virtually this morning.
Wow. So maybe we should, in the resources, we should put a link to Destination Imagination too, don't you think?
Okay.
And I went back in our archives, and speaking of Allison Robinson as coach, I found this photograph from our local Keene Sentinel and Keene Sentinel newspaper from back in 2013. So this would have been one of our critical skills, probably one of our critical skills week-long immersions.
Summer immersions, yeah.
Yeah.
And there it is. So that was the front page of the Keene Sentinel at that time. And I don't know if, can you see that Allison is pointing to a chart pack that says coaching?
How ironic.
So you've been thinking and talking about this a long time, Allison.
Yes. So just to kind of extend on that background, I sort of always grew up wanting to be a teacher, and I knew that that was what I wanted to be doing. But my models for teaching were, the teacher stands up in front of the classroom and gives information, and the students all write down notes, and then you take a test and you study your notes and see what you know. And so I really thought that that's what teaching was. And when I went to college, there wasn't really any discussion about how to teach. We did, your pedagogy and sort of what do you think about education, but there wasn't really any kind of like hands-on instruction until you kind of stood in front of the classroom and actually started teaching. It wasn't until I started my master's degree program at Antioch that I stumbled upon the critical skills program. It was sort of just an elective that I took, and it really resonated with me, the idea of the teacher not standing up in front of the classroom and developing those independent learners. So one of the 9 characteristics of the critical skills classroom was that the teacher would design, mediate, coach, and support learning. And so I really began to question how I had been teaching. Was I really doing those things? Was I engaging students and creating independent learners? I had coached for many years up until that point. My first year of teaching at Monadnock, I got riled right in to be a track coach, even though I didn't really have any experience being a track coach. I ran track all through high school, but had never coached before. And I coached track and field for about 10 seasons. So over time, I really developed under some other great coaches to learn how to sort of design a workout and how to plan what you wanted your athletes to be able to do. But I never really thought about taking that coaching model of what I was doing with my athletes and put it into my classroom as a teacher. And when the idea of teacher as coach came up, it was like light bulbs. Oh yeah, that is what you do. As a coach, you don't run the race for the students. Instead, you help them get to the point where they can run that race and be successful on their own. And then afterwards, you talk about what they did well and where they could improve, and you design practices to help them achieve that goal. And so the idea of teacher as coach really became like that light bulb went, oh, that's what I want to be doing in the classroom. So this slide is a quick video that was created by one of my very favorite teachers, Erin Hunter. She teaches a carpentry class at River Valley Technical Center in Springfield, Vermont. And she and another one of her teachers there created these videos where students were talking about the 9 characteristics of the critical skills classroom. So I wanted to share this because this is from a student's perspective, and it really hit home with me what it means to be a coach.
Well, I believe a teacher is someone who kind of like they instruct people, but they try to drill it in you.
A teacher tells you something, she makes you study, and then she wants you to puke it all back up to it all at once.
Like they tell you what to do, and you don't need to know why you're learning what you're learning. You just kind of learn it, and Miss Hunter just helps you out through that process so you really know what is going on.
Coach is more of like, okay, this is the game plan, yada yada yada, let's go get them.
She kind of lets us figure everything out. That's why we have like 2 facilitators to kind of lead each other, instead of her just telling us, all right, this needs to be done, you go do that, you go do this, you go do that.
She won't give us the answer. She'll mainly ask us questions to help us like look at it a different way. It's kind of like Socrates, I think, was always the philosopher that asked questions to help the person figure it out on her own.
She leaves it up to us to figure out what we need to do, when we need to do it, and just try to figure it out on our own, which I love about this program.
So coming from the mouths of those who experience what it is for a teacher to be a coach and not what they would call a teacher. So what I want to talk about next is sort of how coaching fits into the experiential learning cycle, which is sort of the center or one of the pillars of the critical skills classroom. So when you look at the experiential cycle, you can sort of see where the word coach is in that teacher cycle. So if you kind of follow the loop around where it says teacher cycle, you can see that coach kind of fits right there. But I really think that this is a misconception when you look at the learning cycle. Next slide. So when does actually coaching occur? It kind of happens everywhere. So it's going to start with the collaborative learning community. It's going to happen during your design. It's going to happen when the students are engaged. It's going to happen while you're coaching. It's going to happen during the exhibit, the feedback, and the debrief. So you are in a coaching mindset all the time. So even though the physical act of coaching, where you're working with students, is only sort of happening in small pockets, your brain is always in the coaching mode. So I'm going to use this as sort of a pathway to follow in order to explain to you sort of where and sort of what I'm thinking while I'm trying to coach. So the first piece would be the importance of building and maintaining community. So the first thing that you need to do, or that I do, is to really develop your team. So when I'm coaching, I really want to do a lot of team bonding activities where the team really gets to know one another, they get to depend on each other. Track and field is kind of an individual thing, but there are definitely races where relays where they are depending on each other, but in the end, not one athlete can run all the races, so they really depend on each other to do the best that they can and trust that, even though they aren't running that race, that the person who is doing the best that they can. So building a community is really important in the classroom too, because they're going to be working together to solve problems, and they need to be able to know that they can trust one another. So you develop classroom norms and expectations. I do a, what makes a good teacher, what makes a good student, and we talk about what we want to see in our classroom. And then we do activities that help them to practice their skills and dispositions. So I call them game days. So once a month, I try to do some kind of community builder where students sort of take a break from what they would consider curriculum and instead do activities where they're working together to solve problems. Sometimes I target those specifically with something that I'm seeing is lacking in my classroom. So if it's a communication issue, I'll try to choose a community builder like traffic jam, where they need to learn to communicate with each other in order to sort of solve that problem. But the thing that's really important is that you can't just build your community once. You really need to continue to maintain that community so that students continue to trust one another, even though there may be problems that come up in the classroom throughout the course of the year. So challenges are at the center of the experiential cycle, and the design phase is where the teacher cycle begins. I always start with what is my content and what are the skills and dispositions that I want my students to work on. So as a coach, I would design practice based on the skills I need my runners to develop. They might need speed work, they may need to be working on their endurance. It could be that their handoffs are sloppy or their starts are slow. And so when I decide what I'm going to build into their practice, I will think about those skills and the knowledge that they need in order to be successful. Same thing happens when I am designing something for my students when I want them to learn. So I start with competencies or my curriculum units and think about what do they already know, what do I want them to leave knowing, how is it the best way for me to get them to engage with that material. So I'm sort of coaching in my brain what it would be like for them and sort of going into creating my challenges based on that. The next thing I look at are skills and dispositions. I usually choose one or two that I'm going to work on, and I consistently work on those throughout a quarter. If I feel like they're really getting good at one or another, I might sort of change out for a different skill or disposition. But I really try to focus on just one or two with them. But I think about how much practice have they had with it up until that point in time? Where do I want them to get to with that skill or disposition? And then what do they need to be able to do in order to grow with that? So once I'm clear about their learning, then I need to decide how I want to work in, or how I want them to engage in that learning. So again, with coaching and teaching, it's very similar. I look at how I want to group them together. So do I want my sprinters to work together and my distance to work together, or do I need them all to be working on endurance? I'm going to group them all together sort of randomly so that I have some distance and some sprinters working together. So in the classroom, I'll be thinking about how I want to group my students together. Am I grouping them based on similar skill set? Am I grouping them based on diverse skill set? Do I randomly group them when they walk in the room by handing them a card and whatever color card they get, they just sit at a table and that's the group that they're working with. So I'm thinking about what it is that I want them to do and then grouping them based upon that. The other thing that I need to think about when I'm designing my challenge is how am I going to build in interdependence? How am I going to make them work as a team? Again, one athlete can't compete in all the events or in order to win the meet. So you really need to know what individuals bring to the table and how are you going to do that with them. You can create roles for them so that you have a facilitator, somebody who is sort of a project manager. You could have somebody in charge of all of the materials, or you can divide the materials up between different groups of students so that they have to end up, oh, you need tapes and you need to go borrow it from somebody else. but I'm thinking about how I want them to work together and how I'm going to build that into my challenge during the design phase. The last piece is this zone of proximal development. So how much of a challenge are they ready for? So you can see in the chart there that their level of competence. If they aren't very good at a particular content area or at a particular skill or disposition, if it's low, then you don't want to challenge them too much or else they get into a place of high anxiety. But if you don't challenge them enough, then they get bored. So you kind of have to know who your students are all the time and where they're at. And that can vary between students in your room. It's not as if the whole class is at the same place. So you may have to decide on grouping based on how comfortable students are. Maybe they need a little more support, and so you're going to put them with a stronger student who has those skills, and they have skills that that other student doesn't, so that they can build that competency together. I'm going fast. So after I think about engagement in the design phase, then I'm thinking about presentation. So there are two pieces in the presentation piece when I'm designing is, first of all, who is my target audience going to be? I'm thinking about who they're going to present their learning to. Sometimes it's if they're not familiar or comfortable with presenting yet, they're presenting to me. Sometimes they're just presenting to one another. Sometimes you want to kind of up that challenge a little bit for them and bring in a more authentic audience. Also, depending on what kind of challenge you're giving them, if you're giving them a real life challenge where they are solving a real problem for a group of people, then that group of people becomes their audience. And so the challenge kind of goes up higher. They might need some more support. And so you're thinking about who their audience is when you're designing the challenge itself. You also want to think about their presentation. So you want to think, or I usually try to think about what ways do I have available for them to present? What materials do I have for them to be able to kind of reach out and use? Have they worked with technology before? Do not have access to technology, so that you have to figure out how you're gonna do something pen and paper. Nowadays, thinking about they can't use pen and pencil to do a presentation, how are they going to work together to present something remotely when they are not in the same place? So all of those things kind of go into the design of what they're going to do for a presentation. The last part of the design phase is thinking about the debrief and how you're going to give feedback, and then also thinking about how you're going to connect that to what they've done in the past, and then how are they going to connect that to what they're going to do in the future. So I always think about what debrief tools I'm going to have for them. Are they going to write in a journal? Are they going to debrief together as a class? What is it that I want them to debrief on, so that when I'm building the challenge, I can show them those things while they are in the debriefing process. I can come back and reflect on that with them. I also need to think about how I'm assessing and how I'm going to give feedback to the students. Am I using a rubric? Is there a checklist of some sort that I'm going to use? And then again, like the connections piece. So the picture that you see there is a group of linked challenges that all sort of go together. So the first challenge that I gave my students was more of creating their own personal biography. So they interviewed another student in the class, and they wrote their biography based on a set of questions that I sort of gave them to kind of work on. So how do we get to know each other better? And that led into an explorer's biography. So they took the skill that they learned in the first challenge of how to write a biography, and then they did a biography of an explorer to figure out what are the similar motivations that explorers have. And then that went into another challenge, so that connecting piece. How am I going to connect what they've done already with what they're going to do next? And so in that design phase, I'm really thinking about how to keep that continuum going. So it takes a lot to design a challenge. And once you've designed it, then you're going to give it to your students. And that is sort of, you've done all the planning, you've thought about all the worst case scenarios, you've tried to figure out every loophole they might find. But once they're engaged in the process, you are now sort of stepping back from the ownership of it and giving it to them. But your job is not done. In fact, this is probably the hardest part of teaching that I find. I'm a very type A personality. I like to have control of my classroom. I like everything to be nice and smooth. I joke that I became a teacher because I like to write on the board and everyone has to pay attention to me. This challenges sort of that philosophy in my head, because I am no longer the center of the classroom. The students are, but I'm not gone. And that's really the part where people need to remember, is that just because you step back, it doesn't mean that your job is done. It's not time to go take a coffee break. In fact, you're probably working harder during this phase than you are any other time. So the first thing that I usually do with my students is we chunk the challenge. We give the challenge to the students, and sometimes they read through it alone, sometimes I read through it with them. It all depends on where they are in the process. Again, it's knowing your students and knowing how comfortable they feel with doing something independently. And sometimes it's stepping back when they don't think they're ready to be independent yet, but you're gonna see how it goes. And sometimes it goes great, and sometimes it's a super mess, but it's important to know when to kind of step back. So you provide them with the tools of how to chunk the challenge. Usually I do what is the problem, so identifying what the problem is in the challenge, deciding on what process they're going to go through, and then what their product will be. Again, this is how you've thought about this when you wrote the challenge itself. How do you want students to receive that challenge? Do you want it to be really straightforward and easy for them to kind of pick out the pieces? Or do you want them to really have to work hard to tease those pieces out? And again, it has to do with experience and how that level of challenge. When are you ready to up that for them? And then just deciding where you're going to guide them through that process and where you're going to kind of let it go for them. And again, that all goes into part of that design phase before they even get the challenge. The next part is when the students are at work. So the engagement phase, in sort of the place in the experiential cycle, this is where the students are actually like working on the problem. So they've decided what roles they've had. They know what the problem is. They've figured out the procedure that they're going to follow to kind of solve the problem. They know what the product is. And again, you're really thinking about that zone of proximal development. That safe zone is they are dealing with known content, stuff they're familiar with. They're not really going to get a whole lot out of it if they already know the content. So you want to kind of push them out into where I call the comfort zone. And that's where the best learning occurs, where they're comfortable enough to kind of stretch themselves and try new things. So like little mermaids and dolphins and nice kind animals to help you swim better. And then you just want to always be watching to make sure that students are not going into the danger zone, that they're not too stressed, that they're not too overwhelmed. You're observing constantly. So you're observing to make sure that the strengths and weaknesses of the targeted skills. Are you seeing places where they need more support or less support? You are trying to steer students back to the right direction if they get too far into that danger zone, or if they're sitting too much in that safety zone. You're really monitoring for students who are not engaged. You're looking for possible issues that might arise. Oftentimes, because I work with middle school students, one day they're super good friends, and then the next day they hate each other, but they're still working in the same group, and they're not done with the problem yet. So trying to mediate with them, how do you get through that kind of personal part in order to get back to the learning? How can you divide that out? Can you be working on two separate things but still be working together? And just watching the students all the time to make sure that they are in that sort of comfort zone of learning. Coaching in this part is really situational. So you're watching what students are doing and then trying to make decisions about when you step in and when you just let them sit back. Laura gave me some great advice, and I still follow it to this day, that I keep a pocket full of Jolly Ranchers, and I suck on them during this part so that when students ask me questions, I have something in my mouth that makes me have to think before I have to talk. Is it something that I need to answer, which is my initial gut reaction almost 99% of the time? Or is it something that I can say, hey, why don't you go back and ask your team? Or is there someone else you can ask? Is there what that group looks like, they know what they're doing. Maybe you should go ask them. What other resources do you have to answer that? If you want to build independent learners, which is what I think the goal of most of us are at this point in time, is knowing when to step in and when to stay back. And almost always staying back is going to be the better choice than stepping in. Know that you can't control a whole lot in this phase. It's going to look like chaos. It's going to look messy. All of your planning that you did during the design could go perfectly, or it could totally go astray. And you need to think, if it's going astray, is it still leading to learning? It may not be what you targeted in the very beginning, but is it still good learning? And if it's still good learning, then it's not a wash. You can't be like, oh, that was horrible, I'll never do that again. It just came out differently than you expected it to. And the next phase, when we talk about sort of the next couple of phases with the debrief, is going to pull that out. Coaching during presentation, this is probably the easiest part, because now you just sit back and watch the students show you what they learned. And this is my favorite part to be in, because this is sort of it's the fruits of all their labor, but it's also the fruits of all your labor. This is the part where you get to feel proud of whatever they've put together, because you've designed so well that they're going to put together something that is better than what you had thought of initially. So coaching during presentation is you had to have designed your assessment tool during the design section, and you're going to then use that assessment tool to be able to give your students feedback. So this is, in my school, we're moving towards competencies, and some of the competencies that we've decided on happen to link up with skills and dispositions, which is really nice. So communication is a skill and disposition that we talk about during critical skills, but it's also one of the competencies for my school. So I have set forth for them ahead of time and had a discussion about quality criteria about what good communication looks like. And between the two of us, or the group of us, we have come up with what are those indicators. So in this particular class, we decided, because it was, they had to put together a series of graphs, that in order to show competency, they had to have graphs that clearly communicated the information that they were comparing to the reader. So when the reader looked at it, they could clearly see what those what information was being compared. And so that became the indicator that I used to help assess. You also have planned your debrief, what it is that they're going to do. So in this case, the students went through these rubrics themselves, and as a group, they assessed themselves, and they talked about what they could do better and what they're going to kind of grow with in the next section, because communication is a competency that will keep coming up for them. So it isn't sort of a one-time shot that they're going to have to communicate. Communication is going to be a consistent thing, and so they can see their areas of growth, and they can see where they need to think about doing in the next project in order to make their communication better. And then the last piece after the presentation is the debrief. And for me, this is the part that I always feel like loses out when I feel rushed. And this is probably the most important part. So this is the part, if you're going to give anything up, do not give this part up. The debrief is the part where you learn what the students really learned. Their presentation is the content, but the debrief allows them to reflect on their learning process. So you, as the coach, allow them to see that process. So maybe you took a video of their presentation that they get to go back and see. Maybe you were recording some quotes of the way that they were working through the process that you share with them, whether that be in a journal entry back and forth, so individually, or whether or not you kind of do something as a group. But you want to show them and allow them to think about what was the process of what they did, and think about what did they do well, their strengths, where do they need to grow. I never talk about necessarily their weaknesses, because that's a negative, but a need for growth. Where do you see yourself going in the future? And then setting those goals for next time we do this, and you're going to do it again, what is it that you want to remember that you're going to do that you may not have done this time, or that you did this time, but you need to make sure you do again. And then last, sort of the overall keys to coaching. The most important one is to know your students. That is going to make being in your classroom all that much better. The more you know about who your students are and how they learn and how they function, the better off you're going to be when you're creating challenges, and the better off you're going to be when you are trying to help them to become the independent learners you want them to be. Understand your class dynamic, because unfortunately you don't just have one kid in class all by themselves. They're always working together, and with critical skills you want them to be interacting with one another. So understanding your class dynamic, who works well together, where is their conflict, how do you resolve that conflict, is that conflict resolvable? And you know, is your classroom necessarily the place where you're going to force them to have to work together, or are you going to allow them sort of some breathing space between one another? Remember that you're there to foster independence, and that you should only intervene when needed, and you're not needed quite as much as you think you are. And then the biggest thing is just enjoy your students as they learn. Again, that watching them race as a coach is, you know, the culmination of all the hard work that they've put in and that you've put in, and watching them race on their own is a great feeling.
Oh,
That's what I have to say about coaching.
thank you, Allison. Wow, there's a lot there. I have to say, I love that you remember the thing about the put something in your mouth so you can't talk, because that is one of my favorite tools. I think I use like Bit of Honey or Laffy Taffy because it glues my teeth together, but not everybody likes the sensation of their mouth glued shut. I'm curious though, are there other specific tools like that, or specific coaching moves that you find you use a lot, specific techniques that you use a lot?
I often will when students are working individually in groups and I'm kind of walking around and observing them, if I see something that may be sort of sending them in the wrong direction, or something that I need clarified, I'll sometimes use a sticky note and write a little note on a sticky note and stick it next to one of the students. And then eventually they'll see the sticky note and they'll bring it up to the group and they'll be, oh. If I'm seeing that lots of groups are having the same thing, I'll pause and say, oh, okay, hold up, everybody, it's time to slow down. When you're coaching, you're not necessarily just letting the chaos completely happen. You can step in and say, hey, what, like, you know, your handoffs are looking really bad. Let's stop for a minute and see if we can work on some short technique and then get back to letting you continue to practice. You don't want them to continue to practice something that isn't working for them. So I may stop and give a mini lecture, or I may do like a how-to. Sometimes I'll just write a note on the board and wait for a student in class to notice it, and then they all notice it, so that it's not like so intrusive as stopping everything. I've had situations where students needed mediation, where we've kind of, students are working in a group together and the group just isn't working. One student is refusing. And so I've stopped that process and pulled that student aside and had a discussion with them about, you know, how do they feel like their role is in the group, whether or not they felt like they could rejoin that group, or whether or not they needed something different because they couldn't work in that group for some reason or another. Again, you want it to be about their learning and not necessarily putting them in positions where they feel uncomfortable or it's not working for them. But you want to keep trying. It's not like every single time they get to choose not to be in a group, but maybe just that dynamic was not working, and so you kind of need to take a break.
Cool, thank you.
You know, Allison, one of the things that that was really eye-opening for me in listening to you was how much emphasis you put on the design phase. And I think that that's really good, because it's not a phase that I typically think of as a place where I'm coaching. You know, I kind of think of them, I tend to think of them apart. You know, either I'm designing and then I'm coaching. But, and you, man, you really you unpacked that design phase, you know, like bit by bit. And I kept thinking, oh my God, there's more in here. You know, it's like one of those cars where the clowns keep coming out. So there's more in this design phase. And it really kind of brought home to me the points you made about building a team and knowing your students and creating a level of challenge are all in that design phase. And even with sports coaches, we don't usually think, you know, we think about coaching as what happens in the game when we see the coach, you know, on the sideline waving, you know, his or her arms around, or huddling with the players during the game, that kind of thing. But you don't think about all the preparation that the coach has put in beforehand, designing the training, you know, designing play, you know, helping the players to know the plays. And so that was really, really helpful to me. Is that something that you just kind of, when did you come to that? How did you figure that out, that's coaching too?
Well, I really enjoyed designing the challenges, but what I found was early on that I would create a challenge, and you know, I would see that something worked or didn't work with a particular group of students, and then the next year I would tweak it based on what the year did previously, and I found that then I just had to keep tweaking all the time. But the more that I knew my students, kind of before I started giving them more academic type challenges, the better they were at completing those challenges the way I wanted them to. There were lots of times in the beginning where I would give a challenge and it would come out looking completely different than what I expected it to. And what I've always, my philosophy of education has always been that if a student gets a question wrong, it's because I didn't prepare them enough or I asked the wrong question. So that's the way that I think about challenges, that I want to do as much as I can in that design phase to make sure I'm asking the right question, to make sure that they're going to get out of what I give them what I want them to get. So I try to think of like all the things, all the worst case scenarios. What could go wrong? What is that going to look like? What are some more possibilities that I could put in there? Because again, I'm very type A. I like everything to be structured. So I try to think of all of the pieces, so when I give it to them, I can really step back and I don't have to worry so much that they're going to go way off the rails, although it still happens. But it happens less the more I put into the design and the planning part.
Yeah, it's so satisfying as a coach, isn't it, when you can kind of sit back and enjoy the view. You know, and I hadn't really thought about it that way, but all that work that a coach and the team puts in ahead of time results in the coach having less to do, you know, during the game, you know, because the team is just flowing.
So I also, I haven't really talked about destination imagination a whole lot, but when I started coaching destination imagination, the philosophy is that the students do it, or the participants, they've always been my students, but they do it all on their own. You're not allowed to give them advice. You can't give them hints. You aren't supposed to lead them in any particular direction. It's really, really hands-off. That really tested my whole, oh, I have a great idea. But you can't have a great idea as the coach or as even a parent of a participant. So when my children talk about a challenge that they have, you know, my brain starts coming up with all of these solutions, which I want to give them. But it's not my job. It's not my role. My role is to, you know, oh, you're not communicating well. So let me give you something to work on with one another to help you communicate. And then we'll talk about what worked and what didn't work. And then we'll try it again with a different situation where you have to communicate. So that really taught me how to step back, because you sign a contract that says you're not going to say anything and that you aren't going to intervene. And I take that really seriously. And so I've taken that piece into my classroom too, where I'm not going to intervene, but I'm going to make sure that I've designed it in such a way where, you know, they're going to move in a good direction, no matter what.
Yeah, you know, there is that that saying that the people who are doing the work are the people who are doing the learning. And if and I think it's really, when we talk about critical skills, you know, one of the things we talk about a lot is that the teacher is a co-learner in the classroom. The teacher's big, heavy learning work comes in the design phase. It seems like, the way you're describing it, like that's your big work, and that's where you're doing a lot of learning, because you're learning your kids and you're thinking really intentionally about how much support, how much structure they need, and how you can keep them in that zone of proximal development. And then once it gets to the engagement phase for the students, your work is different, but they're really doing the heavy work because they're doing the big learning at that point. And your job then is to sort of keep them within the scaffolding that you've provided, you know, help them to use that support, and to help them to see that it's there, but also to nudge them back to it. Like, one of the things that I've seen you do that I really like is that, and this is with adults more, but they will, you know, they'll ask you a question and you'll say, that's a great question. I wonder who could answer that question. And there's this sort of moment where they realize that they ask a question that they actually sort of already knew the answer to, or that they could have figured out. And that's one of those ways that you're sort of reminding them that they're the ones that are supposed to be doing the work, not you. But it's hard to get there.
Yeah, and they get really frustrated, and because they aren't used to that. They're used to that sort of instantaneous answer. And to put it back on them, you know, sometimes it's a lot of hard work, because they still will, you know, not, they'll go and ask another adult in the room, or, you know, they won't go to find the answer themselves. And you know, that initial process is really hard for them. But the more you do them, the more you practice it with them, the better they get at it. By the end of the year, they don't even bother to ask me anymore because they know I'm not going to give them the answer.
I'm going to take us back to one of these previous slides, one of these really nicely designed slides for a question I have, Allison. And Laura, maybe this is time to just remind anybody who's participants, if they have a question, they should put it where?
In the question and answer box in the Q&A, and we'll get it to Allison. And if we don't get to all the questions during the time today, Allison can answer some of them on the resources document.
What you were just saying, Allison, was making me think about a point that you made about how one of the most important coaching activities has to do after the presentation and in the debrief stage. And I was thinking about that this slide really illustrates why that's so important. So you have your students, you know, are going through these series of challenges, and they may be closely linked the way it looks like these are, or they could be, you know, a series of challenges and activities that are just the various things you do in your, as a part of your class over time. But that they're going to be related to the student's success in subsequent challenges is going to be dependent on what happened before. And the more you can in the debrief stage, which I guess is here at the end of the challenge, but then anticipate, okay, what needs to happen in between, in this in-between area, in order for this next challenge to be successful, right? And that's where you really, where the coaching, it's almost like all that design work where you unpacked the design work for that first challenge. Now you're doing all that design work again in anticipation of the second challenge, right? So all that, so it's kind of like you repeat that design work every time. When I first was thinking about it, I was thinking, oh, that's all that design work, that's way back here. But it's not. It's like it's here and it's here and it's here and it's here, right? And it's every time you're preparing for a challenge.
Yeah, it's continually while you're sort of watching them engage, you're thinking about, okay, so I'm always thinking about, okay, I kind of know what the theme of the next challenge is because I've taught the same curriculum for so long that I have challenges that I recycle and that I use, but how that design of that challenge has to change. I can't just recycle the exact same challenge. I have to go back and be like, all right, so these guys are not working really well together on this particular skill, or you know, they didn't quite get the idea of telling a story when they wrote the biography. So they're going to write another biography, but this time I need to put more emphasis on telling the story rather than just listing facts about the person. So that's going to tweak the design of that challenge. The next challenge in the cycle actually doesn't have to do with biographies anymore. It then goes into the Columbian exchange. But what we did with the explorers is we sorted the similarities in the reasons that they were exploring. So were they going for religion? Were they going for fame? Were they going for wealth? And so we talked about sort of the categories of different explorers. And then that went into categorizing things when we did the Columbian exchange. So it was a similar skill, but a completely different kind of activity. But I try to, when I'm designing, you have to be thinking always about how is that going to connect and how are you going to take what they have already learned and build on that the next time around.
So Allison, I have another question because we are getting close to time. Let's say I am a traditional classroom teacher and I'm sort of new to all of this critical skills-ish stuff. Even I'm just new to this idea of even being the facilitator. And I want to try it. What is the first thing that you would tell me to do? Just the very first thing. Like I'm like, I've always done straight rows. I lecture the whole time. I do a lot of worksheets. But I'm thinking maybe I want to try something different. Where do I start?
I would start by initiating like a game day. So today we're going to step back from curriculum. I'm going to give you some kind of problem to solve. There's lots of like icebreakers and community builders that are out there to kind of borrow from. But just do something where your students are working together in a place that is fun for them. It's non-threatening for them. It allows you to watch them interact with one another, where you are not the center. They have to figure out how to solve the problem. They have to figure out, but there's no high stakes. If they don't figure it out, then it's not like they get an F. And so they aren't worried about it, and they look at it as being something that is, fun, and it allows you to step back as sort of having to have complete control of the classroom, but in a way that's really safe.
Allison, that what you're saying makes me think about something about that we were saying at the very beginning, is that we're often told to, in order to prepare students to be 21st century workers, we need to be teaching them 21st century skills, and we need to be coaching them for 21st century skills. And what you're making me think about is that how learning is a social enterprise, and then that work is a social enterprise, that when we get into the workplace, we have to work with other people, and it's where you're really coaching when we're coaching to prepare them for 21st century skills, we're coaching them to be in that 21st century workplace, to have all of these skills that you're talking about. So thank you.
So we're about out of time. And I am dropping in the link, or dropping in the chat, a link to the resources page. If you're not able to access this for any reason, we will email everybody, because you had to sign in with your email. So this will go out to you again via email. And that page has both some of the information that Alex shared, or that Allison shared. You put Alex's face up there and you threw me off for a second.
I'm sorry.
Allison's information, and this link will be on there, and the link to the evaluation form, which is what you use to get a certificate of participation if you need it. And next time, in 2 weeks, same bat time, same bat channel, we will be with Alex Chevron, who will be talking with us about trauma-informed experiential learning, and she's awesome. So, Allison, any final words before we sign off for today?
Just enjoy your students any way you can. We're going into sort of a time of diversity, and we have no idea necessarily what kind of interactions students will be able to have with each other, and what interactions you'll be able to have with them. So, just try to find ways to enjoy them, and to allow them to express themselves and do things that they love.
Great. That is a perfect way to finish. Thank you so much for being with us today, Allison. You are amazing, and we're so grateful that you were willing to talk with us today. So,
Thank you. Thanks, Allison. Thank you, Laura.
Thanks to all of our attendees as well. We'll see you in 2 weeks.